Hello guys, welcome to Dr. Night Stare. I know you guys come here to relax and take a nap. So before we go, please hit like and subscribe. By the way, also tell me what time and where you guys listening from. Alright then. Eleanor had dedicated over 10 years to the quiet hum of the local art gallery, her role as a night security guard a solitary comfort. She preferred the hushed hours after dusk, when the world outside felt like a distant, ethereal concept she didn't have to engage with. Her shifts were a predictable rhythm of patrols through cold, silent rooms, past canvases and sculptures that offered no complaints. 2 weeks prior, her supervisor, Mr. Henderson, had informed her of a new acquisition for the backroom archives. It wasn't another painting or bust, it was a towering grandfather clock, carved from a wood so dark and oily it seemed to swallow the beam of her flashlight. "Whatever you do, don't wind it," Mr. Henderson had cautioned. The donor insisted its mechanism is extremely fragile. Eleanor initially paid the clock no mind, but on the fourth night, an unsettling sound emanated from the archives. It wasn't the rhythmic tick of a timepiece, but a slow, heavy, wet thump, like a giant heartbeat. She pushed the door open to find Marcus, her morning shift counterpart, standing rigid before the clock. His gaze was fixed on the pendulum, and he didn't acknowledge her entry. "Do you hear it, Eleanor?" Marcus whispered, his voice dry. "It's not keeping time, it's counting down." "Counting down to what?" Eleanor asked, a chill tracing her spine as she maintained her distance. Marcus finally turned. His face was gaunt, the skin stretched taut over hollowed cheeks as if the very substance beneath had withered away. "To the moment we swap. He's tired of the wood. He wants the bone." The following day, Marcus never arrived for his shift. Mr. Henderson relayed that he had vanished, his car discovered running in the gallery parking lot. Eleanor was asked to cover a double. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the art gallery fell into an unnatural silence. While patrolling the Impressionist wing, Eleanor noticed a disturbing alteration. The vibrant landscapes and portraits weren't facing the center of the room as usual. Every single one was now angled towards the staircase leading down to the archives. A sudden, sharp ache seized Eleanor's chest. "Tick!" she gasped, clutching her heart. It wasn't a muscle spasm. It felt like a cold, internal gear grinding into place. She stumbled into the employee lounge, splashing water on her face. In the mirror, just beneath her collarbone, a small, brass keyhole had appeared. Panic clawed at her. She raced to the main entrance, but the grand oak doors wouldn't budge. She pulled and kicked with all her might, but they felt as unyielding as solid rock. Through the heavy glass, she desperately scanned the deserted street, hoping for a passing car or a late pedestrian, but the sidewalks were empty. The streetlights outside began to flicker in a chilling, rhythmic pattern. Tick, 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 tick. The entire building was transforming. The elegant plaster walls were darkening, gaining the fibrous texture of oily wood. The large windows were slowly becoming opaque, like smoked glass. Eleanor retreated to the security booth, hoping to find a working phone, but the familiar desk and monitors were gone. In their place stood the clock, but it was far taller now, reaching almost to the ceiling. And the pendulum wasn't metal anymore. It was a human arm, pale and lifeless, swinging back and forth, its fingers brushing the floor with each agonizing second. She lifted her gaze to the clock's face. There were no numbers, only a series of words: diner, lake, bookshop, childhood home. The hand spun wildly, stopping briefly at each location. With every pause, Eleanor felt a piece of herself being forcibly torn away. She forgot the comforting aroma of her favorite diner coffee. She forgot the sound of her sister's infectious laugh. She forgot the winding paths of her childhood home. "Please," she sobbed, collapsing to her knees. The clock door creaked open. Inside, where intricate gears should have been, she saw Marcus. He was grotesquely woven into the machinery, his veins serving as wires, his ribs forming the frame. His eyes, devoid of warmth, fixed on her with an expression of pure, chilling envy. "Your turn, Eleanor," he rasped, the sound like dry leaves skittering across stone. The keyhole beneath her collarbone began to twist on its own. She felt her skin hardening, her joints locking into an unyielding embrace. She was no longer a woman. She was a vessel for seconds. With her remaining strength, Eleanor scrawled this message on a scrap of paper she'd found in the janitor's closet, praying the morning cleaner would discover it. But as she looked at her hands, they were already morphing into dark, polished wood. Her heart no longer beat, it only clicked. She heard the front door creaking open. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. Mr. Henderson, surely, coming to check on her. Eleanor hoped he liked his new watch, because she was about to become his entire world. Leo remembered the previous New Year's vividly. He'd been alone, wandering out the back of a dimly lit nightclub, consumed by a quiet despair. Then, standing in a forgotten alleyway, a desperate, heart-wrenching wish had burst from him for Isabel to fall in love with him. It was a pure, unadulterated longing, born of loneliness. And it had worked. Their first date followed the next week. By February, Isabel had moved into his apartment, breaking her lease without a moment's hesitation. Leo had never known such delirious joy. Now, a year later, he was back in the same smoky establishment, the pulsating beat of the music, a discordant soundtrack to the cold dread that had settled in his heart. Isabel's beautiful face, illuminated by the flashing disco lights, turned to him. She gripped his arm, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. "Leo, it's almost midnight." He hesitated, and her smile faltered. "You promised me," she yelled over the deafening bass. They started walking towards the service exit at the back, his heart flopping about in his chest with an acute misery. Foolishly, he had told her about the wish just a few months ago. Isabel hadn't denied or withdrawn her love then. It was too strong, too undeniable. But she had become insistent, a new, relentless determination in her gaze. She made Leo promise to take her to that exact spot this New Year. She wanted a wish too. Leo had tried to cajole her into telling him what her wish was, but she wouldn't. And she was so sweet and loving in her refusal that he eventually gave up, melting into the bliss of being loved by her. "Isabel, please," begged Leo as the thumping noise of the nightclub began to fade behind them. "Sweetheart, tell me." Isabel stopped at the old metal door, drawing him close. She kissed him deeply, a kiss that felt like a drowning man gasping for air, a desperate, fleeting hope. Then she opened the door and stepped out into the chilly night. Outside, a scattered crowd began the rhythmic chant of the countdown. "Here," she called, her voice clear in the sudden quiet. Leo shook his head miserably. How could he possibly give her up? But maybe her wish had nothing to do with him. Maybe the force of their love would keep them together, prevent her from wishing anything destructive. Maybe she simply wanted to wish for a healthy life or success in her career, or some mundane desire. "To the left a bit," he muttered, and against his will, he positioned her on the exact spot where New Year wishes came true. 7, 6, 5, Isabel declared loudly. "I wish to fall out of love with Leo, the man standing here beside me." Cheers erupted from the crowd, and fireworks burst across the night sky, painting it in brilliant hues. Leo covered his face with his hands, a choked sob escaping his lips. And so he didn't see the flash of steel until it was too late, Isabel burying the sharp point of the knife deep into his heart with a guttural grunt of pure hatred. The last words he heard were her whispering so viciously he could barely recognize her voice. "You selfish bastard. Die, you motherfucker. Burn in hell." And then he slumped down on the cold street, his lifeblood gushing out, the click-clack of her heels fading away into the celebratory chaos of the new year. Ethan, a 20-year-old, valued the steady rhythm of his days. Mornings in his small apartment were for coffee and tidying, followed by his university classes. Evenings meant cooking, a quick call with friends, and then, at precisely 8003 p.m., the comforting ritual of settling onto his sofa to watch television. It was his chosen way to unwind after a demanding day. Yet, last Monday, the familiar comfort of the screen felt subtly wrong. About half an hour into a show, an odd compulsion began to pull him. His body moved closer to the display, not by conscious decision, but as if an invisible thread guided him, a strange blend of sleepwalking and acute awareness. Suddenly, a jolt, as sharp as a snap, broke the spell. He crashed back against the cushions, feeling an oppressive presence lift, as though something had been expelled from within him. For the remainder of the night, he lay awake, his gaze darting nervously between his apartment door and the now dark television, an unsettling dread clinging to him. Tuesday afternoon, he called his mother, Sarah, recounting the disturbing incident. Her voice, usually so steady, turned sharp with panic. "Ethan, leave your apartment immediately. Go to the nearest inn, and whatever you do, do not turn on a television." Her fear was contagious. By 8 p.m., he was checked into a quiet inn, ordering dinner delivery. He fell asleep around 80,003 p.m., intending to wake early and meet Sarah at his apartment. But at 2040 a.m., he awoke abruptly, his face pressed against the inn-room's television screen, which glowed with a hissing static. He recoiled violently, his head slamming into the ceiling fan with a sickening crack, and the world went black. He opened his eyes to the sterile brightness of a hospital room. Sarah was slumped in a chair to his right, a heart monitor beeping beside his left. When he attempted to sit up, a searing pain shot through his skull, forcing him back against the pillow. Sarah rushed to his side, comforting him. The nurse later confirmed a concussion, assuring him he was all right, but requiring another night of observation. Sarah promised to explain everything later, urging him to rest. He drifted off once more, only to awaken again around 2 a.m. In the corner of the room, a small, wall-mounted television flickered to life, showing nothing but static. An unseen force began to lift him from the bed. He tried to scream, but his mouth felt sealed, his voice stolen. The force pulled him closer, and as his face neared the screen, a chilling resignation washed over him. He closed his eyes. His consciousness plunged into the television. He found himself in a black, viscous hallway. Before him stood a grotesque creature with disproportionate limbs and a wide, unsettling white smile. It tilted its head, then lunged forward. Ethan struggled against the invisible pull, but it held him fast, pushing him ever closer. Just as the creature's distorted face filled his vision, strong hands gripped his ankles, yanking him backward. He tumbled to the hospital floor with a gasp. He slowly turned, fear battling with relief, to see his mother, Sarah. The television immediately went dark. Ignoring the throbbing agony in his head, he scrambled up and embraced her fiercely. "What was that?" he managed, his voice hoarse. Sarah gently guided him to sit on the bed, her face etched with profound sorrow. A tear escaped her eye as she began to speak. Many years ago, when she and his father were first together, they had fallen on hard times, homeless, starving, and utterly without hope. At their lowest point, a man in a tailored suit had approached them with a proposition. He would lift them from destitution, providing abundant food and money, but in return, they had to surrender the soul of their firstborn when he reached his 20th year. Desperate, they had reluctantly agreed. Now, the man or thing had returned to fulfill the bargain. As Sarah finished, a crushing despair settled upon Ethan. His gaze, fixed on his mother's tear-streaked face, suddenly caught a faint, pulsing light. He turned, his eyes drawn inexorably to the television. Liam, a young man of 20, had made his home on the Isle of Whisperwind nearly 3 years prior. It was a modest stretch of land, roughly 14 kilometers long and 4 across at its widest point. Getting around was easy enough, mostly by bicycle or the local bus, his preferred modes of transport. His days were spent working as an all-rounder at the bustling seaside resort. More often than not, he was tethered to the Friars in the back of Diner's Delight, 8 hours a day at the snack bar. It was thankless and mundane, but the guests were mostly pleasant, and his colleagues, like Claire the cook and Natalie, were truly exceptional. Today had been unusually busy for the winter season. Guests came and went, placing orders, collecting their meals, and disappearing back into their own worlds, leaving Liam trapped in his dead-end job, a path he'd chosen without a degree, now dealing with the consequences. Around 7 in the evening, the snack bar finally quieted, offering Liam a much-needed smoke break. He settled behind the restaurant building, the toxic smoke filling his lungs, calming his thoughts. A flash of movement caught his eye, a rat darting past him, vanishing beneath a grimy garbage can. Liam, an ardent animal lover whose own cottage was a mini menagerie, couldn't resist. He always stopped to observe any creature, no matter how small. So, as was his habit, he tried to coax the rat from its hiding spot. "Hey there, little buddy," he murmured, squatting in a puddle of dubious liquid. "Finding anything interesting under there?" He heard a rustle, but no appearance. "It's been a wild one today," he confided to the unseen creature. "A cigarette helps, but not for you, pal. You're definitely too young." He chuckled softly at his own joke before resuming his seat to finish the cigarette. To his surprise, the rat emerged. It sat directly in front of him, its small, black, beady eyes fixed on Liam, its fur gleaming under the light spilling from the restaurant. "Wow," Liam exclaimed, "you're a big one. The resort's garbage must be excellent." The rat scuttled a little closer, sniffing his shoes. Liam remained perfectly still, not wanting to frighten it. Its paws seemed strangely human-like, not typical for a rat, and its snout was longer, with sharp, pointy teeth barely visible beneath its lips. "I've got to get back, buddy," Liam told it, taking one last drag before extinguishing his cigarette on the ground. The sudden movement startled the rat, and it lunged, biting down hard on Liam's shoe. He tried to shake it off, but its grip was surprisingly tenacious. He grabbed its body and yanked it free, flinging it towards the garbage can before it could strike again. The moment it hit the ground, it sprang up, turning back towards him. Liam scrambled for the restaurant door, pulling it shut just as he saw the rat slowly retreat through the window. Claire, the cook, looked up as Liam stumbled into the kitchen, popping a mint into his mouth. "What's wrong?" she asked. "You look like you've seen a phantom." "There was this weird rat," he explained. "It bit my shoe and wouldn't let go." He showed her the 2 small holes the rat had left. "Jesus," Natalie cursed. "Those don't look like rat teeth." "Exactly," Liam agreed. "It had these messed up canines or something." Like I said, it was a strange rat. A guest walked into the snack bar, and he automatically greeted them, resuming his duties. The rest of the evening passed without further incident. He gave a few kids free ice cream and endured a woman's tirade about the lack of milkshakes. Around 9, Liam prepared to head home. Natalie offered him a ride, but his cottage was only 10 minutes away, and he needed to stop by the store the next day, so he politely declined. He said his goodbyes, pulled on his gloves, started his electric bike, and departed. As he'd mentioned, the Isle of Whisperwind was small. It had 4 coastal hamlets, with mostly rolling fields or ancient woods stretching between them. For some inexplicable reason, the local council had decided only the hamlets warranted streetlights, leaving most of his route home cloaked in profound darkness. Thankfully, he knew the road intimately, his bike light barely illuminating the white road dividers he followed to stay on course. He was about halfway, enjoying the tranquil evening, diligently scanning for crossing bunnies, birds, mice, or whatever other nocturnal creatures stirred at sunset. Then, in his peripheral vision, he caught sight of a deer standing at the edge of the fields. Deer were a rare sight on the Isle, so he braked to observe it. His brakes shrieked, and the deer's head shot up, its gaze locking onto him. "Hey there," he called out, knowing it was too far to hear. "Wow, you're so beautiful." The deer tilted its head. "Don't pretend to hear me, pal. I'm all the way over here." Then, the creature rose. It stood on its hind legs, its front legs dangling unnaturally at its sides, its joints bending in ways they shouldn't. A frantic drumming began in Liam's chest as the definitely not a deer's continued to stare. He stood frozen on the road. He had to pass it. There was no other way home. He could return to work, but everyone had already left. What was he supposed to do? Wait until sunrise? No, he told himself. I'm just imagining things. The deer must have run off. It was just a tree or a weird crop or something. But deep down, he knew that wasn't a deer. He started cycling again. The closer he got to the not deer, the clearer it became. That was no tree. He could distinctly see its eyes fixed on him. He tried to convince himself it wasn't real, that his eyes were playing tricks, but the reassurance was hollow. His speed increased. 20 kilometers per hour, 24, 28, 30. He made it home in record time, only slowing as he turned onto his street. The cold air seared his throat with every gasping breath. He propped his bike against the fence, not bothering to put it in the shed. He slammed the door behind him harder than intended, startling his cat, who had been patiently waiting. He stepped into his brightly lit kitchen, still trying to catch his breath. Daniel, his boyfriend, rose from the sofa, his brow furrowed with concern. "What's wrong, baby?" Daniel asked, and Liam struggled to form words. "There was this rat at work," he stammered, and this freaking deer." "But it wasn't a deer, and its joints bent." Daniel gently interrupted him, guiding him to sit on the sofa. "Take a deep breath," he instructed, and Liam obeyed. "Okay, now, try again." Liam took another breath. "I was smoking at work," he recounted, "and this bizarre rat bit me. It had canines, and it was huge, abnormally so. Then, on my way home, I saw a deer in the field." Daniel listened patiently as Liam finished his story. He handed Liam a glass of water, which he drained in one gulp, then wrapped an arm around him, offering a comforting hug. "Couldn't you just have seen a tree?" Daniel asked, pulling away. "I mean, it's dark, and your mind could be playing tricks on you." "It could," Liam conceded, "but it was so vivid. I couldn't imagine a tree looking like that." "Maybe you just need some sleep." "Maybe." Liam fell silent for a moment. It wasn't a tree, he was certain. So here he was, lying in bed. Daniel slept soundly beside him, but Liam found sleep elusive. He had another shift tomorrow. Perhaps he should ask some of the island's longtime residents if they'd ever heard such tales. Maybe, in the light of day, he'd realize it truly was just a tree, and the rat merely malformed and well-fed. But he didn't know, he really didn't know. It all seemed so incredibly real. He resolved to update his thoughts when he had more information. Daniel hadn't gone to work that day. It wasn't due to illness or a sudden urge to play hooky. No, it was something far more profound. Even if he had wanted to, he found himself utterly incapable. His doom sense was tingling. Throughout his childhood, Daniel's mother occasionally had days where she steadfastly refused to leave their home. When questioned, she would explain that a terrible event awaited her if she merely dressed and stepped outside, even for the mail. This was her doom sense, a profound, visceral sensation in the pit of her stomach, foretelling an unseen disaster lurking just beyond their doorstep. As a boy, Daniel had often scoffed at the notion, dismissing it as another of his mother's eccentricities. She had a myriad of superstitions, avoiding cracks in the pavement, tossing salt over her shoulder if a grain fell, never picking up a tails. Yet, above all these peculiar rules, one mandate stood paramount. When the doom sense began to tingle, one must obey. It had been amusing until it wasn't, a hard-learned lesson that sometimes made Daniel wonder if he was lucky to ever laugh again. Daniel preferred not to dwell on those early memories. Life continued, and it was easy to dismiss childhood experiences as exaggerated or mythologized. At 11, every event felt monumental, and the world always seemed on the brink of collapse. Distinguishing random chance from preordained fate was impossible. As an adult, he had convinced himself he didn't subscribe to such fantasies. The loudest voice in his mind was always quick to rationalize. Sometimes, bad things simply occurred, and happenstance was the only culprit. But deep down, Daniel suspected that was a lie. He hadn't gone to work that day, nor on any subsequent day, because he inherently knew something terrible was waiting. Destiny, fate, fantasy. Whatever comforting label one chose, he recognized it for what it truly was, the undeniable truth. His alarm blared at 6:45 a.m., precisely as it always did, and Daniel emerged from bed, burdened by the familiar sleep inertia that had settled upon him since turning 30. He didn't realize it then. To be fair, he barely recalled his own name before the first spray of hot water invigorated him in the shower. He completed his entire morning ritual, grooming, a cup of store-brand coffee, a plate of scrambled eggs, and only then, as his hand grazed the doorknob, did the sensation strike him. Struck wasn't quite right. It was more like his body being abruptly filled with ice-cold water. A piercing chill raced down his spine, his stomach clenched and plummeted, and his feet felt impossibly heavy, as if weighing 1,000 pounds each. Goosebumps? Perhaps, though it was difficult to distinguish amidst the overwhelming sensation. The world seemed to halt around him, and a panicked hiss echoed within his mind. A distinct command resonated. Don't. Daniel attempted to dismiss the thought, his fingers still reaching for the knob. Stop. His stomach dropped again, and his hand froze mid-air. Nong. Something is wrong. Before he fully registered his actions, he had retreated down the hallway and into his kitchen. The rational voice in his head immediately began to protest. What are you doing? You're going to be late for work, and for what? A random bout of anxiety? Perhaps it was merely anxiety, but it was a powerful, disorienting moment. Daniel suppressed the rational voice, which screamed about write-ups and lost wages, and returned to the coffee maker. Another cup, he decided, was precisely what he needed before heading out. As he lifted the pot, he noticed his hands were trembling. The intense knot in his stomach had eased slightly, but his nerves remained visibly frayed. He poured a second cup, scattering small droplets of coffee across the counter as the pot shook in his grasp. He promised himself he'd clean them up later, when he wasn't pressed for time. Those coffee drops remained on Daniel's counter even as he recalled the events. After quickly downing his second cup, the intense tremors subsided into a dull tremble. He glanced at the stove clock, which read 80,030. Whether it was 2 minutes fast or slow was irrelevant. With morning traffic, he was destined to be late regardless. The rational voice resurfaced, adopting the tone of a disappointed parent, chiding him for his irrationality. What are you waiting for now? Time to get going. It was right. Daniel set his cup down and returned to the door, resolved to reach the office for his daily earnings. His hand touched the knob, and the familiar heavy sensation returned, but this time he anticipated it. Before his body could seize up again, he pushed through the door and into the hallway of the Asteria Tower. A prickle of sweat formed on his neck as the cool air of the AC brushed against him. The leaden weight began to return to his feet, yet he was determined to press on. Stop thinking about it and go. Daniel jogged to the elevator, jabbing the call button. The chime had been out of order for months, but the down arrow flashed its familiar faded yellow. So far, so good. A moment later, the doors groaned open with a rusty sigh and a dull thud, revealing the elevator's smudged stainless steel walls and dated carpet. He put one foot over the threshold when another wave of profound anxiety washed over him. Turn around. Go home now. Don't be stupid. Get in the elevator. Conflicting voices now battled for supremacy within his mind. It felt like an internal war, yet all he wanted was to go to work. He wasn't defusing a bomb or making life or death decisions. This was absurd. So, against the desperate warnings of his body, he stepped into the elevator, rode it from the 4th floor to the 1st, and traversed the lobby with a brisk pace, ignoring the tempest churning in his gut. When he reached the double glass doors of the Asteria Tower and peered out into the broader world, he saw nothing out of the ordinary, nothing at all. Early morning traffic flowed in its predictable stop-and-go rhythm, and pedestrians continued their hurried commutes. Birds flitted down Elmwood Avenue, oblivious to the wide-eyed man staring at them through an inch-thick pane of glass. Everything appeared completely, utterly normal. Daniel let out a nervous chuckle, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. He thought, I really worked myself up for nothing. His rational inner voice chimed in. Yes, I've been telling you that the whole time. Now get moving. Hey man, are you all right? A voice came from behind him, from the front desk. Daniel turned his head a little too quickly to see Ben, the desk clerk, leaning forward, a look of concern etched across his brow. Daniel must have walked right past him without notice in his rush through the lobby. You've been standing at the door for like 5 minutes, and pardon my cliches, but you look like you've seen a ghost. Ben wiggled his fingers as he said ghost, trying to add a touch of levity. Daniel shook his head, offering another chuckle. He liked Ben. For a glorified doorman, he was surprisingly warm and perceptive. Daniel shrugged, shoving his hands into his pockets. Shit, sorry. Just having a weird morning is all. He paused, then added, Must have been that second cup of coffee giving me the jitters. Ben let out a hearty ha and leaned back in his chair. Well then, I need whatever you're drinking, 'cause I'm on my third cup and it's not doing anything. He produced a paper coffee cup from the desk and rattled it lightly. Not much excitement here to keep me awake. Heck, you're the most interesting thing I've seen all morning. They both laughed, and it felt good. It really did. They chatted for a few more minutes before Daniel wished Ben a good shift and turned to leave. He felt somewhat better after the exchange. The rational voice chided him for stalling, but Daniel took it in stride. With rationality seemingly regained, he took a shallow breath and pulled against the stainless steel handles of the doors, letting the cold, early morning breeze wash over his face and cool the lingering sweat from his absurd panic. His hands were shaking again, and his insides remained a battleground, but for a fleeting moment he felt good about his decision. No flights of fantasy, no surrender to irrational fears. He was not his mother, and if he had any say in it, he never would be. He gave Ben one last wave and pushed through. Daniel stepped out onto the sidewalk, hearing the whoosh of air as the door closed behind him, a sound set against a symphony of idling engines impatiently waiting at the red light. From somewhere in the distance, an ambulance siren echoed off the buildings along Elmwood Avenue. He was outside. Now he just needed to round the corner to the lot where his compact car was parked, no doubt covered in a fresh layer of snow. He turned to walk, silently cursing himself for forgetting to lift his wipers before the snowfall. 10 steps down the sidewalk, the siren was much closer, and he could now see the ambulance's flashing lights approaching down the street. He had a moment to wonder how it would navigate the gridlock on Elmwood Avenue. He paused to watch it, and the knot in his stomach twisted once more, the cold water sensation spreading through his limbs. Doom. A loud screech ripped through the air as the ambulance barreled down the south side of Elmwood Avenue, heading directly for the standstill traffic. The driver attempted to slam on the brakes, but to no avail. The salt trucks had not yet reached Daniel's neighborhood, and the road was treacherous with ice and slush. Even with his foot pressed to the floor, the driver was powerless to prevent the inevitable. The vehicle designed to save lives was about to become an instrument of destruction. As Daniel watched, the ambulance closed the distance at what he estimated to be 50 miles per hour, gaining yards with every blink. He stood frozen, staring with dawning horror at what was unfolding. His stomach plummeted into his feet. What are you waiting for? Run. The ambulance swerved over the center line, plowing between two sedans at the tail end of the traffic jam with a loud, mechanical crunch, sending both cars careening towards the sidewalk. A red sedan on the opposite side of the street struck the curb violently, flipping onto its side and crushing a man against a wall before he could even utter a scream. All at once, the paralyzing weight in Daniel's feet vanished, and he was sprinting towards the doors of the Asteria Tower. The ambulance struck the next set of vehicles. One of them, halfway into the adjacent lane, had its driver's side crushed by the unstoppable force, sending it spinning into the next car in line. The screaming had begun by then, a cacophony of fear and agony set against the sickening crack of metal on metal. The carnage was rapidly gaining on Daniel, and he tried to convince himself he couldn't hear the faint, wet squelching beneath each impact. He was lying. Daniel reached the doors and ripped them open, practically diving into the lobby as the ambulance reached the exact spot he would have been standing moments before. Ben was at the window, staring out in horror at the unfolding situation. He saw Daniel rush in and turn to yell something, but Daniel kept moving. What the fuh? Ben never got to finish that sentence. A man in an SUV, attempting to escape the chaos, had backed halfway onto the sidewalk when the ambulance smashed through his fender, thrusting the SUV into the southern window of the Asteria Tower. The glass shattered instantly, spraying Daniel's back with tiny pieces of shrapnel. As he reached the elevator, the back half of the SUV now rested where the sitting area usually was, and Ben was wedged somewhere underneath. In a panic, Daniel hammered the call button, what must have been 100 times, his gaze fixed across the ruined lobby at the hell unleashing outside. At the front of the intersection, a dump truck idled in the left lane. The ambulance, now a mangled white and red hunk of scrap metal, found its final resting place in the back of that dump truck. The impact boomed like a lightning strike, landing feet away. The elevator doors opened behind Daniel just as he witnessed the ambulance driver crash through the windshield and break his neck on the steel wall of the truck ahead. The force of the blow propelled the dump truck into the intersection, where further terrible crunches followed. A strange sense of zen often accompanies shock. In films, when tragedy strikes and a character goes into shock, the true depths of their feelings are rarely explored. As it happened, for Daniel, it was almost pleasant. He was in shock when he stepped into the elevator. The sounds of screaming, shattering glass, and twisted metal faded as the doors slid shut, replaced by the dulcet tones of elevator music. To this day, he couldn't tell if the music originated from the elevator or his own mind. He was faintly aware of a stinging sensation on the back of his neck, but beyond that, the lights were on, but no one was home. The period between entering the elevator and finding himself curled in a ball on his bed remained largely lost to him. He only returned to Earth when his phone began buzzing in his pocket. He pulled it out and answered without looking, the motions occurring automatically. "Hello?" The voice that emerged from Daniel's mouth felt alien, flat and hollow, like a hypnotized child's. "Daniel, it's Sarah. It's almost 10 o'clock, and I don't see you at your desk. Your time card shows you haven't clocked in either. Are you coming in today? Because if not, you really needed to let me know beforehand." Our attendance policy is very clear. A minimum of 2 hours notice for any call-off, no exceptions. I don't want to write you up, but, of course, it was Sarah, Ms. By the Book, always dotting her I's and crossing her T's, quoting the employee handbook like scripture. Daniel had never much cared for her, and he liked her even less at that moment. He mostly tuned out her monologue, missing the last few things she said. He could hear the distinct sound of an approaching helicopter, and then a thought occurred to him. Did she say 10 o'clock? Had it really been that long? Even the rational voice was incredulous. Sarah was still speaking, something about points and disciplinary action, when Daniel found a moment to interject. There was a terrible accident. Right outside my apartment in the Asteria Tower. I almost... He absent-mindedly fumbled for the TV remote and turned the television on his dresser to KRN News 8, immediately seeing an aerial view of Elmwood Avenue, complete with the carnage below. "Turn on the news, Sarah." KRN News 8. Daniel. "I don't see how this has." He hung up on her mid-sentence and focused entirely on the TV screen, marveling at the level of destruction he had almost been a part of. The aerial view of the scene cut away to a news reporter on Elmwood Avenue, who was doing her best to maintain professionalism despite the horror show before her, and mostly succeeding. Daniel turned the volume all the way up, walked to the window overlooking the street, and pulled the curtains open, listening for the grisly details. First responders are on the scene now, working to free those trapped in their cars. Officers at the scene are unsure of the exact number of casualties, but the death toll is estimated to be at least 10, with at least a dozen others suffering serious injuries. In total, 20 vehicles were involved in this terrible accident, and rescue operations could stretch well into the afternoon. For KRN News 8, this is your fault, Daniel. Daniel tore himself away from the terrible scene below, nearly screaming at what he thought he had heard. He frantically thumbed the remote, trying to rewind to confirm his auditory hallucination. He found the button and jumped back 30 seconds, feeling the remote grow slick with sweat in his hand. In total, 20 vehicles were involved in this terrible accident, and rescue operations could stretch well into the afternoon. For KRN News 8, this is Elena Petrova. Daniel hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath, and he let it out in a massive exhale. He felt foolish for believing the news had spoken directly to him. He must have been losing his mind, but who could blame him? He had just witnessed the death of an unknown number of people, and could have easily died himself if he hadn't moved when he did. This stark realization caused his knees to buckle. Until that moment, he hadn't truly processed what had occurred, and all at once it crashed over him like a tidal wave. He fell onto his bed and began to cry. He cried for the man pinned by the red sedan, for the ambulance driver whose final sight was the back of a dump truck, for Ben, oh God, Ben, who was always so warm and friendly, now cold and dead beneath an SUV, just 3 floors below. All this destruction, all this unnecessary death, and all of it could have been avoided if your fault. No, that wasn't right. There was no way it could have been his fault, could it? All Daniel had done was try to go to work. There was nothing he could have done to cause that. It was the ice, the traffic, the ambulance. There was no way for him to stop it. He was just going to. YOU should have stayed inside. Bullshit. That's just superstitious bullshit. Even if you stayed inside, all of those people would have died anyway. That might have been true, but no buts. Do you hear yourself? You're starting to sound just like your mother. His head was at war with itself once again, the rational voice desperately vying for control. For the remainder of the day, Daniel tried his best to actively avoid thinking, with varying degrees of success and failure. Try as he might to keep it out of his mind, flashes of the accident barraged his senses at regular intervals, bringing with them a cavalcade of conflicting emotions, grief, anger, fear, and guilt. The guilt was the worst, inexplicable and unacceptable, yet undeniably present. It didn't help that the scene was directly outside his windows, and it certainly didn't help that he could still hear the tow trucks, ambulances, and fire engines. By 9 that evening, he was exhausted in every sense of the word. He doubted he could have cried anymore. His eyes were deeply sunken within 2 very red rings. His neck ached from the tiny bits of glass he had eventually found and removed with tweezers. He checked the news before bed. The final numbers had been tabulated: 12 dead, 15 injured, among whom were several children. His heart broke all over again as he turned off the TV and settled into his blankets and pillows. Tomorrow will be better. Tomorrow he could start to put this behind him. If only. His alarm began blaring at 6:45 a.m. on the dot, just as it always did. And when Daniel slammed his hand on the snooze button, he immediately became aware of 2 things: the tense knot in the pit of his stomach and a panicked whisper at the edge of his mind. Doom. That was how it all started. Arthur had always lived by the clock. 5:30 a.m., the alarm blared, followed by the ritual of brewing black coffee potent enough to strip paint. Then, off to whatever dead-end job sustained him. For the past 6 months, that meant Abyssal Harvest Corp., a sprawling warehouse on the fringes of Blackwood Cove, Oregon, where the air eternally carried the scent of brine and slow decay. His task? Quality control tester for shrimp. Yes, he understood the incredulity. His job was to eat shrimp. Or, at least, what he believed were shrimp. The opportunity had seemed innocuous enough. An online advertisement promised, no experience necessary, competitive pay, must have a strong stomach and no seafood allergies. Freshly laid off from a cannery, a casualty of automation, and with savings rapidly receding like the tide, Arthur figured, why not? The interview was a formality, a cursory meeting with a perpetually bored HR representative named Marlene, who simply slid a form and pen across the polished desk. Sign here and you're in, she droned, her eyes glazed with routine. The warehouse itself was a colossal humming beast, a labyrinth of conveyor belts and frost-rimmed freezers. Arthur's station, the tasting lab, was a sterile white box, tucked away from the main floor's industrial roar. Fluorescent tubes hummed like trapped insects above a stark metal table and stool. A one-way mirror dominated one wall, and Arthur often felt the prickle of unseen eyes watching from its dark depths. Each day, he'd clock in, don a hairnet and gloves, and wait for the samples. The process was simple. A slot in the wall would open, and a tray would slide out, bearing 10 to 15 shrimp, peeled and deveined, sometimes raw, sometimes seasoned. Arthur would consume them one by one, diligently noting texture, flavor, and freshness on a digital tablet. Too salty? Mark it down. Rubbery? Flag it. An off-putting aftertaste? Report it. Then the tray would retract, and another would appear. 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. It was monotonous, but at 25, an hour plus benefits, it was a king's ransom in Blackwood Cove. Initially, Arthur relished the work. Shrimp had always been a quiet indulgence. Cocktail shrimp at gatherings, shrimp scampi during long-forgotten date nights. The samples were consistently premium, plump, succulent, delivering that unmistakable briny snap of fresh catch. He'd chew slowly, savoring the burst of ocean flavor, the subtle sweetness beneath the salt. His notes were glowing, excellent firmness, perfect balance of umami, no fishy undertone. He even began dreaming of shrimp endless platters shimmering in a sea of crimson sauce. But around the third week, things grew, peculiar. The textures shifted first. One batch felt off, too fibrous, almost stringy, as if tougher threads were woven within the flesh. He noted it, slightly chewy, possible overprocessing. The next day, a batch arrived, and one day a batch arrived, and a few seemed to possess a faint, lingering motility. Arthur blinked, attributing it to an optical trick, but no tiny, involuntary spasms rippled beneath the translucent shells, as if the creatures weren't quite deceased. He typed, fingers hesitating, residual nerve activity? From his cannery days, he'd seen fish twitch post-mortem, but shrimp were meant to be inert. He mentioned it to Marlene during their weekly check-in. Her voice, tinny through the intercom, dismissed it with a laugh. Oh, that's just our new sourcing. Deep-sea varieties, fresher than fresh, keeps the flavor locked in. Arthur nodded, though a seed of doubt had been planted. Deep-sea shrimp? Blackwood Cove's waters were shallow, stormy, not the abyssal depths Marlene implied. As weeks bled into months, the anomalies compounded. Some shrimp bore an iridescent sheen, like oil on water, shifting from blue to green to purple under the lab lights. Others tasted metallic, a coppery tang that clung to his tongue for hours. Headaches became a constant companion after shifts, pounding migraines that blurred his vision. At home, he'd collapse onto his couch, staring at the ceiling, feeling an unsettling sensation, as if something was subtly shifting beneath his own skin. One night, after sampling a particularly bizarre bat shrimp that popped like caviar when bitten, releasing a viscous, warm fluid, he dreamed vividly. He found himself submerged, not in water, but in an abyssal dreamscape. A vast, dark ocean trench unfolded around him, lit only by the ghostly dance of bioluminescent forms. These weren't fish. They were elongated, segmented things with too many glowing eyes clustered in rows, pulsing with an alien light. They beckoned. When Arthur instinctively reached out, one lashed onto his hand, its mouth parts unfurling with the horrifying grace of a blooming predator. He awoke gasping, his palm itching where nothing was present. The next shift, the trays came relentlessly, without pause. He barely finished logging one batch before another slid out. The shrimp were larger now, almost prawn-sized, with veins that pulsed faintly under their translucent flesh. He bit into one, and it squirted. Warm, not cold as it should have been. The flavor was richer, almost creamy, with an undercurrent of something earthy, like soil after rain, mingled with a faint taste of blood. He flagged it, unusual temperature sample warm upon arrival. Flavor profile altered. Silence. No reply from the intercom. Usually, Marlene or someone would offer an immediate flimsy excuse. Just silence. His body had begun its insidious transformation. He noticed it in the mirror one morning. His skin grew paler, almost translucent, revealing a network of prominent blue veins, particularly stark around his neck and wrists. A relentless itch plagued him, driving him to scratch until skin broke. The headaches that had once merely throbbed now carried whispers, faint as static, bubbling up from an unknown source. At work, the one-way mirror sometimes fogged, as if a breath had been exhaled on the other side. He'd catch glimpses of movement in the reflection, shadows shifting when his gaze wasn't directly upon it. And the shrimp. God, the shrimp. Their appearance had changed. Not just texture or taste, but shape. Some had extra ridges along their tails, tiny protrusions like nascent limbs. Others bore what looked undeniably like eye spots, dark dots that seemed to track his movements as he lifted them to his mouth. He tried to quit once. After a shift, tablet clutched in shaking hands, he sought out Marlene's office. "This isn't right," he stammered. "The samples. They're not normal shrimp." She offered that same glazed smile. "Nonsense, Arthur. You're our best tester. Top scores every week. Here's a bonus." She slid an envelope across the desk, 500 cash. He took it. Bills, after all, demanded payment. That night, the itching intensified to a fever pitch. In the shower, he scratched his forearm raw, and something moved beneath the skin. A ripple, like a worm burrowing. He stared, water cascading over him, convinced it was a hallucination. But no, it happened again. A small bulge traveling up his arm, then vanishing. The dreams grew more frequent. Always the Tretch, the glowing creatures. But now they spoke. Not with voices, but with impressions. Hunger, ancient patience, a promise of belonging. He'd wake with the taste of salt on his lips, though he lived miles from the shore. The trays never stopped. He consumed hundreds a day, his stomach distending painfully, yet he never felt full. The shrimp were unmistakably alive now. They would curl when touched, their antennae, actual antennae, twitching. Some tried to escape the tray, scuttling toward the edge. He'd pin them with a fork, force them down. The taste was an exquisite agony, sweet decay, an electric vitality surging through him. His notes grew erratic. Sample exhibits motility. Recommend halt. Flavor induces euphoria. Potential contaminant. Eyes present. Multiple. Still, silence from the intercom. He began sneaking samples home, wrapped in napkins, hidden in his lunch bag. Under his kitchen light, magnified with a cheap loupe he'd bought online, the truth stared back. They weren't shrimp. Segmented bodies, jointed legs folded tight, mandibles tucked beneath. Larval forms, perhaps, of something vastly larger. Deep-sea horrors, harvested from trenches no submersible should ever breach. He spent nights searching online forums devoted to cryptic marine life, leaked documents from obscure oceanographic expeditions, whispers of benthic anomalies caught in trawls off the continental shelf, things that mimicked commercial species to infiltrate supply chains, parasites that rewrote hosts from within. The itching spread everywhere, his back, his scalp, between his toes. In the mirror, his eyes had changed, pupils slightly elongated, irises flecked with that same strange iridescence. One shift, the slot opened, but no tray emerged. Instead, a voice, at last, from the intercom. Not Marlene's. Deeper, resonant, like pressure waves in the crushing depths. "You've adapted well. Integration phase complete." The lights in the lab dimmed, the one-way mirror cleared, revealing not an observation room, but darkness, an abyss lit by faint bioluminescence. Shapes moved beyond, massive, segmented, chillingly familiar. Arthur looked down at his hands. Without pain, the skin split, peeling back like a discarded shell. Beneath, something pale and jointed flexed, testing the air. Were they legs? Feelers? He couldn't quite tell. The tray arrived then, empty, an invitation. He understood. His job hadn't been to test shrimp. It was to become the vessel, to carry them inland, to spread the brood. The whispers clarified. "We are the tide that returns. You are the bridge." Arthur stepped toward the slot. It widened, accommodating. The air grew cold, briny. As he crossed the threshold into the wet dark beyond the wall, he felt the last vestiges of the old Arthur slough away. Only hunger remained, the eternal, patient hunger. Back in the tasting lab, a new stool waited, a new tablet. Soon, another applicant would sign the form. Arthur was now the offering, awaiting the next unsuspecting soul. Eleanor's living room window almost always looked out onto her quaint garden path. Most mornings, she could open the blinds, gaze at her roses, and start her day without a hitch, most of the time. But on April 5, 2012, She awoke to the croaking symphony of unseen amphibians and the ominous splashing of heavy bodies. A pack of alligators, she thought, were certainly lurking in the misty swamp beyond her window. They didn't come in, and she didn't feel threatened, just profoundly disoriented. She smelled the rank, stagnant water and the decaying vegetation. She could feel the humid air seeping between the panes, carrying with it the buzzing of unseen insects. The creatures beyond seemed oblivious to her presence, and she blinked, rubbed her eyes groggily, and stared out into the familiar garden path, now dimly lit by the morning sun. She would have assumed she was dreaming or hallucinating were it not for the traces of damp mud and strange fibrous weeds that had been carried onto her rug by the unexpected draft. Anyway, it continued like that for a while. Sometime in 2018, she returned home after a particularly grueling shift and slumped onto her sofa. She glanced toward the window, expecting the gentle sway of her cherry tree. Instead, the blinding white glare of an Arctic ice cap beat down on her, the wind howling a frigid symphony. She sighed, pulled a blanket over herself, and went to sleep in the spare room. It had become commonplace at this point. She knew her normal view would come back eventually, so she just resigned herself to the temporary displacement. Sometimes it was worse than others. There was one night, late in 2020, that she nearly suffocated as her window suddenly revealed the churning, sulfurous maw of an active volcano. A torrent of choking ash and searing heat rushed in, pulling her from her sofa. She heard her plants crackle and furniture splinter as molten rock spat over her coffee table, and she was barely able to gasp for air before the heat overwhelmed her. Up was down, left was right. Everything was chaos. And then she was back on the floor of her living room, peeling volcanic ash and charred debris from her sopping hair like some disheveled cartoon character. She couldn't help but let out a nervous chuckle at the sheer absurdity. It went on like this for years. Every so often, her living room window just became some sort of portal to somewhere else. She was almost never in any sort of danger, and she never mapped out any sort of pattern to the timing or locations, so all she could do was hunker down and let it pass. It rarely lasted more than a few minutes. But just last night, all of that changed. She was fast asleep, when suddenly a soul-rending shriek pierced the air. She jumped to her feet in a cold sweat. She'd never heard anything like that before. Her eyes slowly, hesitantly panned over to the window. She expected to see a war zone or ancient ruins or something. Instead, what greeted her gaze was a swirling vortex of iridescent, sickly green clouds, beneath which pulsed a vast, shimmering ocean of broken glass. Periodically, a shard of glass began to ripple rapidly, then shatter inward, emitting yet another piercing, unearthly wail. In its place was a void of absolute darkness, before eventually this canvas of unreality appeared to crystallize, a new fragment of glass into existence. With some trepidation, she stepped toward the window. She had no idea what this place was, but she felt it calling to her. Are you familiar with the call of the void? It's a phenomenon where people standing over cliffs, balconies, and the like suddenly feel an urge to jump, even if they're not remotely suicidal, sometimes followed by an intense sense of panic and remorse. This felt similar. She had no desire to enter this alien chasm, but she also felt herself inexorably drawn toward the entryway. She couldn't stop her legs from walking closer and closer. Her ears began to ring with a bizarre, sickening hum, indistinct whispers that, frighteningly, almost made sense. She felt the hairs on her arms stand up. It was cold, colder than she'd ever felt before. It almost seemed like whatever unseen force was drawing her into the abyss was pulling all warmth and light out of her apartment. She shivered and took another unwilling step. As she approached the window, a limb shot up from below her field of view. A skeletal appendage gripped the bottom of the window frame and scrabbled desperately for purchase. Its sinews flexed as it attempted to pull its unseen body up. Eleanor froze. She had no idea who or what this creature was. She didn't know if it was human, if it meant her harm, if it was a victim or a perpetrator, or... And before she had a chance to even process that, the window returned to normal. Her standard garden path was back. The only evidence of that hell was a handful of pulverized glass fragments lying on the sill, the familiar view now her anchor to reality. Every other time the window shifted, it went to somewhere easily identifiable. She didn't know what was causing it or where these areas physically were, but they logically made sense as a space on this earth. But that place was an impossible nightmare realm. She talked to physicists, mystics, historians, even the peculiar archivist at the old library. No one seemed to have the foggiest idea what was going on, or why the phenomenon was isolated to her living room window. Almost none of them believed her to begin with. All she knew was that she'd signed the papers to sell the apartment, and it was slated for demolition. At first it was a relief, but then it hit her. What happens if the phenomenon occurs again after the window is reduced to rubble? Mark went blind on the 4th of July. As much as he wanted to shift the blame, to point fingers at the cheap propane tank or the faulty grill regulator, he knew the buck stopped with him. Who could have foreseen that trying to ignite an old barbecue, left too long with the gas on full blast, would result in a flash of fiery horror? Daniel, his 13-year-old son, that's who. While waiting for the ophthalmologist in the emergency department, Mark heard a video on Daniel's phone, then his son's voice. Dad should have watched these grill explosion videos before he tried to light it. Though Mark wanted to snap, he couldn't disagree. He shouldn't have looked at barbecue safety videos. It might have saved him sitting in an ED on a holiday, pressing his palms into his bandaged face, wondering how anything could hurt so much. "Turn that off, Daniel," Sarah, Mark's wife, commanded, then asked Mark, "Is the pain medicine helping?" "Yeah," Mark lied. Sarah, empathetic to a fault, didn't cope well with sickness or injury. By the time the ophthalmologist arrived, an hour later, the second dose of painkillers had actually kicked in. His eyes and face still seared from the worst pain of his life, but he didn't care as much about it. He didn't care when the doctor sutured his eyelids shut. He didn't care that Daniel was filming the procedure. "Put that away," Sarah snapped. He did manage to care when the doctor said he wouldn't be blind for long and that the sutures and bandages would come off in a week. Just 7 days. You can listen to some audiobooks to pass the time. Armed with a prescription for stronger pain medication, the doctor's recommendation, and Sarah's meticulous notes, they left the emergency room. "Thank goodness," Sarah said as she reached over Mark to start the seat warmer, giving him a peck on his cheek where the bandages ended. No permanent damage. The way things turned out, permanent damage eyes ripped from his head, visual cortex removed, would have been a blessing. If there was anything good about Mark's accident, it was the timing. There wasn't much happening in mortgage brokering the week of the 4th of July, so his business wouldn't take a noticeable hit. He couldn't help out around their lakeside cabin, bonus, which meant Sarah had plenty to do instead of worrying that the doctor was wrong and he would, in the end, be blind. She settled him on the couch in the living room where he could smell the fresh pine of the cabin walls. She made him pasta bake. She didn't serve any grilled food. At first, Mark didn't think much of what he saw behind his closed lids. Hazy blobs and patterns, dancing patches of light and dark that coalesced into objects and silhouettes, like the after images you get when you've been out in the sun and squeeze your eyes shut. He had those. He chalked it up to the pain meds and, what did the doctor say? The healing of his eyeballs. It was only a day after the grill bomb, Daniel's title for the disaster, so he thought, no big deal. At first. By the next day, the silhouettes weren't acting right. They were no longer random shape-shifting blobs. They would track through his visual field, track like they had their own lives. He followed the shape of Sarah as she walked out the front door to run an errand. And when Daniel's heavy footfalls woke him from a nap, he saw his shape traverse the hallway at the top of the stairs. It was as if some signal was getting through his stitched-shut eyelids and inch-thick bandages. But he wasn't getting any signal from the big window overlooking the lake, no signal from the lamp on the end table. Nothing but those moving forms. "Hey Siri, call Daniel." Siri did what she was told. Daniel picked up. "What, Dad? I need you to empty my bedpan." Mark waited for a chuckle, got none, then plowed on. Seriously, could you fill up my water bottle? Why didn't you ask me when I was down there? I still had water when you were down there. I still had water when you were down here. Daniel gucked, but, dutiful son he was, hopped to it. Mark heard his door open upstairs, heard his feet in the hallway. He drained his giant, insulated tumbler and turned his head to the stairway. There it was, the silhouette gliding downward through space. He couldn't see the stairs or the painting on the wall, just Daniel's moving form. Trying to describe what he saw as Daniel approached him was difficult. He looked like a blown-out black and white video image where the whites were too white and the darks had fuzzy edges bleeding one into the other. Except there was no white. He was more dark on a dark background moving through space. Dad, you're creeping me out, watching me like that. He floated around to the kitchen, began to fill the cup. Even though Mark's eyes couldn't technically see, he couldn't take them off him. I'm not watching you. I can't see, remember? Mark tried to laugh at the incomprehensibility of it. He shouldn't have been able to see anything, and yet he was. But what did he know? He was the guy who tried to light a faulty grill. He thought about asking Daniel to do a search on ghost images or some such. But then his son would start to worry. He was going nuts and tell his mom, who would really worry he was going nuts. Nobody needed that. He approached Mark and reached out his arm, which looked insectoid and angled in all the wrong places. There was no cup in the hand that Mark could see, but he heard the tumbler clunk on the coffee table. Thanks. The insect arm retracted. The shape stood there, a few feet from Mark. Its head was giant, much larger than Daniel's actual head, atop a spindly neck. Set in the middle of the dark blob of face, Mark thought he saw a flash of white. Teeth, they looked like. Pointed teeth, like fangs. Reflexively, Mark jerked back. His foot kicked the coffee table, and the tumbler banged to the ground. Oh, shoot, I'm sorry, he blabbered. "'S-okay, the lid was on." As he bent down to pick it off the floor, Mark saw what looked like spines coming out of its back, like spikes on the dinosaurs that Daniel used to obsess over. Mark sucked a frightened, kid-like breath. "You're freaking me out," Daniel said. His pointed white teeth fangs, Mark might as well call them what they were, flashed. "I'm freaked out because I can't see my kid," Mark tried again to laugh, but the weak sound caught in his throat. That enormous black blob of a head nodded. As he left, Mark saw the ends of its hands were talons. By the next day, Mark couldn't deal with the images any longer. The only time he'd let anyone enter the bedroom was to drop off food and water. Despite his best efforts to act normally, Sarah was spiraling into her empath hellhole. Mark kept his back to her when she entered the room with a sandwich or a plate of cut-up chicken, none of which he touched. He didn't want to eat anything cooked up by the creature that placed the tray on the nightstand, a squat, gray, slimy thing with dozens of tooth-filled mouths that covered her head, her chest, her arms. When she spoke, each of the mouths moved. Even her eyes were ringed with teeth. "I'm worried you're not eating," she said. Mark's eyes were fixed on the far wall. They saw nothing but a black screen. "Mark," I said, "I'm worried you're not." "I heard you," Mark said. "I'm not eating because the pain meds mean I haven't taken a dump in 3 days, and I'm depressed. With all this, I can be depressed, can't I?" "Sure," she said quietly as she closed the door. When she settled into bed that evening, Mark turned his head away from her and into his pillow. Even so, as she leaned over to kiss him, he saw in his peripheral vision those mouths puckering and sucking. She said, "I love your sweetmeats." "What?" I said, "I love you, sweetie." Mark got his courage together and risked a glance at her. The mouths leered, they smacked open and closed. He thought he caught a whiff of rotting meat. Later, the shape that should have been Daniel sat in a chair across the room from Mark's bed. He'd offered to look up things for Mark on his laptop. He thought it might help. Like Mark said, he's a dutiful son. A good kid. Letting him in there, letting him sit that close to him, that was a mistake. His fanged mouth seemed to stretch from one bat ear to the other. The jaw clicked audibly when he talked. His arms were double-jointed. His skin was jet black and covered in oozing boils. He, like his mother, stank. "Here's something," he said. Sometimes, when you go blind, your visual cortex can become excitable and... He slowed down. Disinhibit, Ed. His 13-year-old Mark thought, working his lips over an unfamiliar word. Still his 13-year-old, thank God. Then Daniel. Not. Daniel lifted his oozing giant head. But it says you see clear images. I thought you said you just seeing shapes. I am, Mark lied. It's probably some version of the same thing, the whole visual cortex excitable thing. And this is cool. It says, neighboring neurons from auditory or somatosensory areas can invade the visual cortex. Yeah, super cool. Understanding how the visual cortex crisscrossed with the other parts of his brain was above Mark's pay grade. Anyway, thanks, D. I need to sleep a bit. And not see you, not smell you. Go play a video game or something. Catch you later. There was something wrong with his voice, a guttural, metallic undertone. I am losing my mind, Mark thought. First the eyes, now the ears. Now the ears. Daniel, Mark said. Daniel. Not? Daniel stopped at the door. What? Still that same growl. Mark's mouth went dry. Remember not to tell your mom I'm seeing shapes, okay? She's worried enough. I'm not worried, though, he growled as he walked through the doorway. Because I'm going to rip you apart and feast on your... The door closed. Mark's eyes tried to widen, but the sutures held tight and sent stabs of pain through his lids. A terrifying thought stabbed into his brain. Not Daniel. That thing is not my son. Mark didn't let either of them into the bedroom again. The Sarah thing left food and water outside the door. He listened to its concern. This really isn't normal, Mark. Its worry sounded convincing. But after it finished fussing over him, Mark could hear its voice, like the sound of grinding gears. I'm going to gorge on your soft parts. I'm going to slake my thirst with your blood. Yes, Mark knew he was hallucinating, both auditory and visual, and, when he got close enough to them, olfactory. He got better at using Siri and ChatGPT's voice function. You learn a lot when you're alone in your bedroom with nothing but an iPhone. He learned to talk like a doctor, visual, auditory, olfactory. He learned about neuroplasticity. He learned about Charles Bonnet syndrome. This information should have been a comfort to him, and it was, to a point. But when Daniel Thing and Sarah Thing scraped along the hallway muttering in their awful voices, Mark wasn't so comforted. He was terrified by them and terrified by the conviction that he was going insane. But, and this was the most comforting, his insanity wouldn't last long. One thing his research told him was that, once the sutures were removed, light would hit his retinas, his optic nerves would fire, and his visual cortex would reset. It would stop getting confused by sounds and smells. It would stop confusing the other parts of his brain. July 11th, suture removal. The restoration of normalcy. Mark opened the bedroom door. In the hallway stood both Sarah and Daniel. He'd been forcing himself to think of them as Sarah and Daniel, his wife and kid, who were definitely not things, not monsters. When he saw them, though, he gasped and tried to cover it with a cough. They, his Daniel, his Sarah, had grown larger and more grotesque. Daniel stood 2 feet above him, his multi-jointed arms flicking this way and that. The boils on his midnight black skin had burst, small white worms wriggled out of the holes and dropped like rain onto the ground. Sarah had ballooned to the width of the hallway itself. Impossible. The many mouths over her body were chattering and clacking their teeth. The stench of decay filled his nostrils. As much as Mark tried, he couldn't think of these things as his family. He couldn't close his eyes and not see them. He couldn't not hear them, not smell them. Impossibly, the giant creatures were able to fit themselves in the car. The smell made him gag, so he opened the window. The Sarah monster said it was 40 degrees out and asked whether he felt feverish, but Mark didn't answer. It took every effort for him not to fling open the car door and jump from the vehicle. They trudged across the clinic's parking lot in the nearby town, the monsters at his side chattering away and stinking to high heaven. Mark kept silent. 30 more minutes, he thought. Maybe 20, if I'm lucky, maybe 10. He heard other people in the lobby of the building, but didn't see any shapes. He felt relieved. The world outside was normal. It was only because he'd been cooped up with his family that he was seeing them like this. Other voices chit-chatted comfortably in the waiting room. Mark focused on them and not on the grating chatter from the things sitting next to him. Just a few more minutes. The office was efficient, and they were taken into an exam room. They sat in silence. Mark looked at his lap, but he could still smell them. The door to the exam room opened. "How'd it go?" the doctor asked in a clear human voice. He made no comment about the monsters in the room, no comment about the smell. "Honestly, a bit rougher than I thought it'd be." "Pained?" "More that my mind started playing tricks on me. Sounds a bit crazy, probably." "Not really," the doctor said, and again, relief flooded Mark. As he peeled off the bandages, he went on about visual stimuli and cortices, all things Mark knew from his time with ChatGPT. For the first time since his accident, Mark was relaxed and uncoiled. When the bandages came off, he could see light, real light coming in through his lids. "Nurse," the doctor said, "lower the lights, please." From behind his lids, Mark could see the lights dim. "Ready?" the doctor asked. "This can sting a bit." Mark felt a tug on his left lid, heard a snip, then felt a sting. He kept his left eye closed until he felt the same on his right. "Okay then, open sesame," the doctor said. When Mark didn't open, he leaned in close and said, "Mark, you good? Open your eyes, please." He did. The light, even though dim, hurt his eyes. The doctor was close enough to kiss him. His blurry face filled Mark's visual field. "Blink a few times for me," the doctor said. Mark followed orders, and after a few blinks, the doctor came into focus. Normal features. Normal, human. The sigh Mark gave contained more joy than he'd ever felt before. "Looks good," he said, smiling and straightening his back. "We'll just need to do a couple of tests to—" A scream. Mark's cut him off. Behind the doctor, against the wall of the exam room, stood his family. One was 8 feet tall with worms crawling out of its skin. The other a stinking blob of flesh, each of its many mouths grinning.